The imported marble of the Blackwood estate felt perpetually cold beneath Eleanor's bare feet. Here, in the highly monitored confines, every movement was scheduled, every micronutrient tracked by the staff under Vivian's meticulous direction. Vivian Ashworth, an epitome of cool elegance, treated Eleanor with the clinical detachment of a researcher handling a precious, yet inanimate, asset. Do you like romance stories? Then leave a comment saying everything has a purpose, so I'll know that this story truly spoke to your heart. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now, it's free, and you'll receive more stories that touch the soul. 94.8% of the people who watch these videos are still not subscribed to the channel. If you're one of them, don't let this moment pass. Subscribe right now. It is fast, it is free, and it can bring into your life stories that inspire, heal, and reignite hope and love. Your resting heart rate is up 3 points this morning, Eleanor. We need absolute equilibrium for the pre-implantation phase. Julian, commanding yet reserved, watched the interaction from the periphery of the vast drawing room. His posture suggested quiet disillusionment, a practiced withdrawal from his wife's absolute control. Eleanor, acutely aware of the cameras, focused only on the phantom image of Clara's medical dossier, the singular justification for this suffocating surveillance. She was not a guest. She was the flawless vessel Julian and Vivian had paid for. The silence in the marble halls of the Blackwood estate was not peaceful. It was heavy, weighted by electronics and expectation. Eleanor knew the camera's small, almost invisible apertures in the ceiling molding. In the antique clocks, even disguised within the humidors in the library, Julian sometimes retreated to. She moved with the rigid economy of someone who knew every action was catalogued, processed, and judged against the impossible standards set by Vivian. Her perpetually observant eyes scanned every corner, a habit born of years spent guarding her younger sister, and now amplified by the suffocating reality of her confinement. She carried the weight of her sister's life, a burden made tangible by the phantom image of Clara's medical dossier, the critical reports of the heart ailment, that served as the singular, excruciating justification for her immense sacrifice. The pre-implantation phase was less medical and more ceremonial. It demanded perfection. Her meals were prepared by a chef who only communicated through a nutrition monitor screen, ensuring the precise 1,800 calories and optimal micronutrient profile were met, measured down to the last milligram of folate. She spent 2 hours a day performing low-impact movements designed to maintain uterine health, always supervised by a physical therapist whose expression was as blank as the pristine walls. Every micronutrient, every minute of sleep, every fleeting expression was tracked, quantified, and reported back to Vivian, the ultimate curator of this delicate process. Eleanor, lean and physically and emotionally fatigued, focused on the geometric pattern of the Italian silk rug, avoiding Vivian's demanding gaze. "I was contemplating the revised dosage schedule for the estrogen patches," she replied, referring to the aggressive, hormonal regimen that was rapidly reshaping her internal landscape, preparing her body to receive the life Julian and Vivian desperately wanted. She dared not mention Clara, the ghost that kept her compliant. Vivian didn't look up, her detachment absolute. "The dosage is non-negotiable. We are optimizing receptivity, Eleanor, Doctor. Churn has determined that your progesterone levels need to stabilize 3 points higher by Friday. Compliance is paramount. You understand the gravity of the investment we have made, not just financially, but in terms of lineage and the legacy this child will inherit." Lineage. The word grated against Eleanor's nerves. She wasn't carrying a baby. She was curating an Ashworth heir, a flawless biological extension of Julian's industrial dynasty. She was a temporary precious asset, highly maintained and utterly disposable once the contract was fulfilled. Julian often appeared unexpectedly, always reserved, always measured. His appearances felt less like surveillance and more like a brief, authorized break from his own crushing schedule, yet always held within the confines of a public space. He would find Eleanor in the library, ostensibly to retrieve a rarely read volume on corporate law, yet he would linger, his gaze catching hers across the immense distance of the room, a shared recognition of the sterile, airless atmosphere they both inhabited. "You choose the older novels," Julian observed, his voice a low, commanding rumble that barely broke the acoustic barrier of the room. He stood leaning against the high, dark wood bookshelf, his immaculate tailored appearance contrasting sharply with Eleanor's simple, mandated uniform of expensive but colorless grey cotton. Eleanor closed the book, placing a finger on the page number. "They require more concentration," she said simply, meeting his gaze for a moment. "They make it easier to forget where I am." The honesty was a dangerous risk, a minor violation of the unspoken rule that she was only permitted to discuss medical or dietary schedules with the intended parents. But Julian didn't recoil into his role. Instead, a flicker of something indefinable recognition, perhaps shared loneliness, a quiet understanding of confinement crossed his reserved, handsome face. "I understand," Julian said, taking a slow step forward, stopping well within the sideline of the nearest camera, yet close enough for the intimacy of the moment to feel intense. "This estate, it can be confining, even when you are meant to belong here." His measured posture seemed, for once, slightly less rigid. Eleanor felt a sudden, terrifying urge to confide in him, to ask if he truly felt the same emotional suffocation that pressed against her chest nightly. She remembered the sheer terror of facing Clara's diagnosis, the desperation that led her to the Solstice Guild, signing the Aegis contract and its invasive stipulation, the necessary lie she carried like a shield. She looked down, focusing on the intricate, expensive knot in the rug again. "It is only temporary," she managed, injecting a professional, practiced detachment into her voice that she hoped would satisfy the silent observers. Julian, however, didn't retreat to his professional shell. He watched her, his powerful presence filling the space. "Temporary for you, perhaps. But for the rest of us, some cages are built to last." He paused, a pregnant silence stretching between them, thick with unsaid acknowledgments. "How's your sister?" The question was unexpected. It was the first time Julian had ever referred to Clara directly, outside of the dry legal requirements outlined in the contract, which simply stated that funds would be transferred upon implantation confirmation. The contract demanded clinical distance, and Julian had just deliberately breached it. Eleanor's protective wall nearly cracked. "She is stable, waiting for the final clearance of funds for the scheduling." She swallowed, forcing back the tidal wave of anxiety that always accompanied thoughts of Clara. "I appreciate you asking. I read the file," Julian admitted, quietly. Spoke of Clara's medical dossier not as an asset ledger, but as a document detailing human tragedy. The surgical reports, the diagnosis. He made the medical portfolio sound less like bureaucracy and more like a profound burden. "A great deal of strength is required to make the kind of choices you have made, Eleanor, the kind of choices driven by duty." "It wasn't a choice," she said, her voice tight, reflecting the relentless pressure. "It was the only avenue left. There were no others capable of providing the necessary speed and scope of funding." Julian nodded slowly, a profound gesture that confirmed his observation. He saw the stark reality behind the sterile transaction. He saw her motivation, and in seeing it, he saw her. This was the moment the relationship transcended the simple dynamics of asset and owner, employer and contracted service provider. He saw the woman, Eleanor Vance, trapped by duty, not the flawless vessel mandated by the Aegis contract. This exchange, this moment of mutual, unburdened recognition, marked the dangerous, powerful, and utterly forbidden beginning of their connection. It was a shared secret, built on mutual confinement and the recognition of fundamental, devastating desperation. Vivian, with her sculpted features and hyper-tuned senses for social and emotional infractions, recognized the shift immediately. Even without access to the specific audio logs of that library conversation which Julian may have quietly suppressed. A thought that made Eleanor's stomach twist. Vivian sensed the change. She recognized the fractional softening in Julian's posture when Eleanor was in the room. The subtle, prolonged eye contact, the slight, almost imperceptible lessening of his emotional distance. Vivian's control was not merely physical. It was deeply psychological, built on decades of carefully managed appearances and structured silence. And she knew instinctively when her structure was being compromised. The atmosphere in the Blackwood estate chilled considerably, the air growing brittle and tense. "We are entering the final monitoring phase before the transfer, Eleanor," Vivian announced the following week, standing over Eleanor's meticulously organized medical tray. Her voice was pure ice, cutting and clinical. "Your emotional stability is critical. Any stress hormones, any psychological fluctuations could jeopardize the integrity of the process. We cannot tolerate risk now." She held up a small, unmarked bottle of a newly introduced supplement. "This regimen will assist in maintaining optimum calm and equilibrium. You will take this before bedtime, administered by Nurse Dana, who will observe the ingestion." Eleanor knew better than to argue, but the increase in surveillance and mandated chemical stability felt oppressive. Designed not just for her physical health, but for her emotional suppression. "Is this a required protocol, Vivian, or an additional safeguard implemented by your team?" Vivian's eyes cool, calculating elegance defined, narrowed slightly, a gesture more menacing than outright anger. "It is necessary. Julian and I have invested too much into this process to risk instability now. We have chosen the highest caliber genetic material, the most pristine environment, and the most compliant candidate. You must remember your place in this arrangement, Eleanor. You are here to perform a specific, biologically necessary function. Nothing more." The implied threat was palpable, heavy in the sterile air. "Do not interfere with the structure. Do not disrupt the balance." The balance, however, was already fracturing, splintered by the deep, long-standing cracks in the Ashworth marriage. Julian and Vivian were a fortress of wealth and power on the outside, a spectacle of societal achievement, but internally. They were a mausoleum of repressed desires and unaddressed wounds. One evening, during a mandatory family dinner, cold formality intended to acclimatize Eleanor to the intended parents. Though no one ever spoke of the child in anything other than clinical terms, the fissure widened into a visible chasm. They were seated at a custom-made Brazilian walnut table that could comfortably seat 20, but held only 3. The dining room was illuminated by a chandelier of painful, cold brilliance that seemed to amplify the tension. Julian, unusually late, entered the room. His tie slightly loosened, his posture suggesting a practiced withdrawal and sheer exhaustion rather than relaxation. "My apologies. The board meeting ran late. The merger negotiations in Singapore are reaching a delicate phase requiring my direct intervention." "Delicate but managed, I assume?" Vivian responded, her tone sharp, cutting through the formality like a razor. She picked at a sliver of organic sea bass, her movements precise. "We discussed the timing of this merger, Julian. It must be finalized before the implantation. I require your full presence and attention here for the first trimester. You agreed to that stipulation in the protocol planning." Julian sighed, a sound of heavy weariness he rarely permitted himself to display, a sign of his deep disillusionment. Eleanor, silent and hyper-observant, watched the tension coil between them. "Vivian, I am running a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. I cannot simply put it on pause for 9 months for a single, albeit critical, procedure. The market doesn't wait for optimal uterine environments." "No?" Vivian countered, setting down her fork with a precise, chilling clink against the imported porcelain. "But I waited. We waited years for the genetic testing, years for the right agency, years for the perfect candidate, Eleanor." She flicked a dismissive, proprietary glance toward Eleanor, reducing her immediately back to a controllable component part. "And I refuse to have this process compromised because of your corporate distractions and your increasing lack of focus." "My corporate distractions are what pay for this entire infrastructure, Vivian." They ensure this pristine, highly controlled life we have, Julian retorted, his voice rising slightly, betraying his tightly held control. And what good is this life? Vivian demanded, her voice low but laced with dangerous wounded frustration, if it is not directed, if it is not executed perfectly. You are always seeking to escape the necessary structure. You view the protocol as a burden, Julian, not a privilege of our station. You resent the control that ensures our success. Eleanor realized then the root of Vivian's absolute crushing need for control: fear. Vivian was terrified of losing the structure, terrified of any variable, be it the market, Julian's independence, or the emotional state of their surrogate, that she could not perfectly regulate. She needed clinical perfection because she feared genuine, messy vulnerability and the chaos of the uncontrollable. Julian looked across the vast table at his wife, and the look he gave her was pure, unadulterated disillusionment. It wasn't overt hatred, but a profound sadness, the weary, soul-deep acceptance that the marriage was a cold, mutually agreed upon prison of appearances. "I need air," Julian muttered, pushing back his heavy chair with unnecessary, rebellious force. He walked out, leaving Vivian alone at the enormous table, staring fiercely at Eleanor. "Do not mistake what you just saw as weakness, Eleanor," Vivian commanded, her face instantly regaining its cool composure. "It is merely the pressure of high stakes. Your primary concern remains compliance. Remember, Clara, Vivian knew exactly how to leverage Eleanor's immense sacrifice. Mentioning Clara's medical dossier was her weapon. A constant reminder that Eleanor's moral obligations superseded any personal discomfort or observation of marital discord. But the seed of genuine connection had been planted, fertilized by the observation of that deep marital discord. Eleanor saw in Julian a mirror of her own isolation. His gilded cage was simply larger, more intricately designed, and equally inescapable until now. The incidents of connection became more frequent, tiny, controlled rebellions against the protocol. Julian began leaving specific, non-business-related books on the library table when he knew Eleanor would be there for her mandated reading hour books, not about law or finance, but history, philosophy, and poetry, all subtly marked with passages about freedom, self-determination, and the cost of obligation. They were discreet gifts, a silent conversation in a house where every wall had ears and eyes. One afternoon, Eleanor found a worn volume of romantic poetry waiting for her, strategically placed on her preferred reading chair. Tucked inside the pages, marking a particularly evocative sonnet about freedom and captivity, was a folded piece of heavy stock paper. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, desperate rhythm. This was a massive, contract-breaking breach of the Aegis contract, which explicitly forbade unauthorized, non-essential communication. She quickly palmed the note and tucked it into the deep pocket of her grey trousers, feigning deep, intense concentration on the page, willing her body to regulate its cortisol output. Later, locked in her high-security suite, ostensibly the safest room in the house, but the one where she felt most trapped, she unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was Julian's strong, precise, yet hurried and urgent. The audacity of the request stunned her. The observatory was an unused tower room Julian occasionally visited. A blind spot, a verifiable vulnerability in the Blackwood Estate's flawless surveillance system, meant Julian had actively, systematically mapped the facility's flaws. He was deliberately breaking his own rules, putting himself, and more dangerously, the future of the contract, at risk. The risk was astronomical. If Vivian or the staff discovered her movement, the Aegis contract could be nullified and Clara's life-saving surgery funding withdrawn, pushing her back into the abyss of desperation. But the urgency in his note, the need to discuss Clara's future without Vivian's clinical mediation, drove her. He was risking his life to protect Clara's. She reached the winding, ornate staircase leading up to the observatory. The air here was noticeably cooler, mustier. A rare corner of the house where Vivian's obsession with antiseptic perfection hadn't fully conquered the old stone. Julian was already there, standing silhouetted against the dusty, curved glass of the observation dome, staring out at the remote landscape of pines and mountains. He wore only a dark t-shirt and track pants, a stark departure from his usual armored tailoring. For the first time, he looked genuinely exposed, unguarded. "Eleanor," he greeted, his voice low, a conspirator's whisper that seemed absorbed by the heavy silence of the tower. "Thank you for coming. I know the risk I asked you to take." "You risked everything sending that note," she whispered back, crossing the cold stone floor toward him. "Why here? Why now? Why circumvent the legal channels?" Julian turned, his imposing height overwhelming the small space. He didn't deny the risk. "Because I needed to speak to you, not the vessel, Eleanor. I needed to ensure that Clara's financial security is established immediately, permanently, and irrevocably before the implantation transfer. I don't want the funds contingent on the successful completion of the pregnancy or the contract itself." Eleanor stared at him, incredulous. "That defeats the entire punitive and financial purpose of the Aegis contract. It gives me all the leverage and removes your guarantee." "I know," Julian admitted, stepping closer, deliberately closing the safe distance they usually maintained. The air crackled with a sudden, charged, desperate tension. "But I have moved the funds. They are secured in an irrevocable escrow account, legally obligated to release for the surgery next month. Regardless of what happens here with the contract, the implantation, or with Vivian. The paperwork is filed." The sheer weight of this unilateral action defying his wife, circumventing the very contract he co-authored, risking massive legal repercussions, hit Eleanor like a physical blow. He had removed the ultimate leverage that held her captive. He had given her Clara's life, free of the conditional obligation. "Why, Julian?" she managed, her voice barely audible, thick with disbelief and a sudden, dangerous hope. Julian looked down at her, his dark eyes intense in the dim light, burning with an urgency that transcended business. "Because you deserve to know that the sacrifice you are making, Eleanor, is honored. Not as a transactional payment for a service rendered, but as a profoundly courageous act of love for your sister. Because I owe you more than a detached business arrangement." He paused, and the rigid professional barriers that had been so carefully constructed over the preceding months crumbled entirely, revealing the emotional isolation beneath. "Because the moment you walked into that sterile room at the Solstice Guild and told me, without apology, why you were doing this for a life you were determined to save, I realized I hadn't felt anything real in this house for years." Julian's confession was raw, desperate, and utterly shattering to the foundation of their arrangement. "I watched Vivian treat you like an inanimate object, a precious biological component. And yet you carry a depth of fierce loyalty and genuine feeling that she actively suppresses in her own life. And I—" He hesitated, searching for the precise words to articulate the devastating shift in his reality. "I find myself drawn to that reality. To you." Eleanor felt the dizzying rush of panic and exhilaration. This was far beyond the scope of their contract, beyond the bounds of acceptable social conduct. This was Julian Ashworth, the titan of industry, choosing genuine messy connection over the clean lines of social preservation. "Julian, you can't," she breathed, stepping back slightly. Instinctively trying to enforce the professional distance that their environment demanded, the ingrained fear of the surveillance still strong. "This is dangerous. For all of us. For the baby." "Is it?" he challenged, his voice softening, becoming persuasive. "Or is it simply honest? I have lived a life built on preservation, on managing optics and maintaining absolute control. That life is sterile, Eleanor. It's hollow. And the closer we get to the implantation, the more I realize I cannot go back to that emptiness. You are the only real thing in this mausoleum." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, stopping just short of contact, respecting the invisible boundary that the Aegis contract had drawn around her physical self. But the intent, the yearning, the emotional transgression was devastatingly clear. "The arrangement has transcended the contract," Julian confessed, the words weighty with implication. I didn't hire a surrogate, Eleanor. I brought a conscience into my home, and now it's telling me the cost of this life is too high if it means crushing yours entirely. He revealed the depth of his disillusionment, speaking of years spent under Vivian's calculated clinical gaze. Of their attempts to have a child that had failed repeatedly due to Vivian's insistence on absolute genetic perfection and control, rather than embracing the vulnerability of natural processes. Their marriage had become a partnership in business and image management, devoid of warmth or shared emotional purpose. I need to protect you now, Eleanor. I need to make sure you are safe, regardless of what happens next, he concluded, his voice heavy with new responsibility. But Eleanor, the woman who had spent years being submissive and self-sacrificing for Clara's sake, felt a fierce new wave of defiance rise within her. She was not a damsel needing protection, nor was she a valuable asset to be quietly managed. She looked directly into Julian's eyes. Protection is not enough, Julian. Safety for Clara is secured, and you have achieved that monumental task. But I won't be a secret. I won't be hidden away because you finally found a genuine connection after years of sterility. She stepped back, distancing herself physically, forcing him to see her as an equal, a formidable partner, not an object of affection or pity to be saved. You acknowledge the arrangement has transcended the contract, Eleanor stated, her voice steady and firm, despite the rapid pulse thrumming in her ears. Then we stop operating under its terms entirely. If this connection is real, and if you truly believe I possess the loyalty and conscience you value, then I am not merely a vessel for your child. I have an inherent right to be part of that child's life, not as a contractually obligated nonentity, but as a recognized, contributing partner. This demand was the true reckoning. Shattered the comfortable narrative Julian was constructing, the one where he saved her. And then they went their separate, honorable ways after the birth. Eleanor, you know what you are asking, Julian said, his eyes widening slightly. A flicker of panic mixed with awe at her courage. That is legally, socially impossible in our world. Vivian will use every asset she owns to fight this. The public fallout will destroy my professional standing. Vivian wants control. Eleanor cut him off, asserting her newfound strength. And you have spent your life letting her have it. I am asking for partnership. Not just for me, but for the life we are creating. I demand to be recognized for my inherent right to be part of her world. If you choose me, Julian, if you choose honesty over social preservation, then you choose a difficult path where I am not a secret, but a mother with a voice. The silence in the observatory was absolute, broken only by the distant, silent hum of the Blackwood Estate's security grid. Julian, the commanding titan of industry, stood before her, stripped bare of his defenses. Faced with the monumental choice, the life he had, built on gilded lies and corporate necessity, or the terrifying, real, and profoundly difficult future Eleanor was demanding. He looked at her, at the lean build, the fierce conviction in her tired eyes, and saw not the submissive surrogate who signed the Aegis contract, but the woman who would move mountains for love. A mother, he repeated, the word tasting unfamiliar yet strangely right. You are asking me to choose a public, painful confrontation with Vivian to potentially destroy the foundation of everything I've built, and to embrace a life that society will condemn. I am asking you to choose reality over control, Eleanor corrected, taking another step forward, asserting their shared space. And yes, Julian, that means facing Vivian. It means shattering the marriage that has been dead for years, and dealing with the consequences in the light, not the shadows. Julian finally reached out, and this time his hand made contact. Resting gently on her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she had shed. The gesture was tentative, reverent, and deeply felt. I choose reality, Julian whispered, the decision already made, irrevocably setting them both on a collision course with Vivian Ashworth. I choose you. The confrontation was swift, devastating and predictable in its raw intensity. Julian told Vivian the truth the next morning, not in the privacy of their massive bedroom, but deliberately in the sunroom, the glass walls acting as a brightly lit stage for the final, brutal act of their relationship. Eleanor stood silently by the doorway, her presence a non-negotiable part of the new reality, a visible challenge to Vivian's authority. Vivian, rigid in her pristine white suit, listened to Julian's declaration, the transferred funds, the transcendence of the contract, the acknowledgement of his feelings for Eleanor with an initial chilling calm. "You are throwing away decades of calculated positioning, Julian," Vivian said, her voice dangerously level, echoing off the cold glass. "For this? A desperate, morally compromised woman who signed a non-disclosure agreement? You have breached the sanctity of our partnership for fleeting emotional weakness." "She is the most honorable person I know," Julian countered, his own voice resolute, fortified by his choice. "And I am done with calculated positioning, Vivian. Our marriage has been a high-stakes transaction based on image, and I am dissolving the agreement entirely. I choose the honesty she represents." Vivian turned her icy gaze to Eleanor, a gaze full of surgical precision and pure contempt. "You manipulated him. You exploited his vulnerability. You believe that because you are carrying the genetic material, you have a right to the life he promised me." "I have a right to my daughter," Eleanor asserted, standing firm, refusing to be reduced to a variable. "And I refuse to raise her in the toxic isolation of this estate, or as a hidden secret. She deserves a life built on unconditional love and truth, not controlled deception." Vivian's composure finally fractured. She screamed, a sound that was less controlled rage and more profound, devastating pain, rooted in the years of emotional repression and the obsessive need for clinical perfection that had failed her utterly. The ensuing confrontation ripped apart the carefully constructed foundations of their shared life, revealing Vivian's deep-seated emotional wounds, her inability to accept anything less than absolute control, and her paralyzing fear of vulnerability, which had successfully driven Julian away years ago. The legal battle that followed was brutal, highly secretive, and managed by Julian's formidable legal team to protect Eleanor's privacy and the secured funds for Clara. The resulting divorce and settlement left Vivian with unprecedented wealth, but without the control she craved, and without Julian. Eleanor was moved from the Blackwood estate immediately after the implantation, hidden safely in a remote, protected residence near the coast while the legal and medical transition protocols were finalized. She carried her pregnancy with the profound certainty that Clara was safe, and that she was carrying her daughter, Aurora, into a profoundly real, albeit complicated, future. He and Eleanor faced the challenges together, navigating the early years of Aurora's life, the intense scrutiny, the residual legal threats from Vivian, and the sheer difficulty of building a shared life born from such desperate, unconventional circumstances. They moved away from the high-security fortress of the Blackwood estate to a place of mutual choices, large, sunlit home near the Pacific coast, far from the suffocating demands of Manhattan society. Julian learned to trade control for collaboration. Eleanor learned that she deserved happiness and partnership, not just duty and sacrifice. Clara, healthy and thriving after her successful heart surgery, often visited, forming a close bond with her older sister. Years passed. The scandal faded into complicated history. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and Eleanor, now approaching 40, stood on the porch, watching Julian, now in his early 50s, push their daughter, Aurora, now a bright, curious toddler, high on a sturdy wooden swing set Julian had built himself in the yard. Aurora's laughter was bright, unrestrained, the sound of a child raised in love and truth. Julian walked back toward Eleanor, his tailored armor long replaced by comfortable, well-worn clothes, his demeanor softened by years of genuine connection. He took her hand, his powerful grip grounding her. His face, though marked by the passage of time and the stress of the choices they had made, looked younger, lighter. "She's magnificent," Julian said, his eyes full of uncomplicated pride and love. "She is," Eleanor agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "A defiance born from desperation." "And a love forged in a cage," Julian added, gently pulling her closer, their bodies fitting together in a way that spoke of years of shared vulnerability and trust. They had built a life, complicated, profoundly real, centered entirely around their daughter and the difficult, honest path they had chosen. The sacrifice that began in the sterile confines of the Solstice Guild and the Blackwood estate had led them to an improbable, enduring partnership. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had only sought to save her sister, had unexpectedly saved Julian Ashworth too, forcing a reckoning that changed everything. Their love story wasn't easy or conventional, defined initially by contracts and surveillance, but by the ultimate, radical choice to shatter perfection for reality. It was a love born from duty, tested by fire, and sustained by the simple, radical act of choosing honesty over control. They had found their impossible peace watching the sunlight fall on their daughter, the culmination of a choice that changed everything. If you enjoyed reading about Eleanor and Julian's journey from contract to connection, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. The confrontation began not with fire but with a glacial coldness that permeated the sunroom, making the triple-glazed glass feel insufficient against the emotional winter. Julian Ashworth stood opposite Vivian, the polished titanium table between them acting as the final, desolate battlefield of their marriage. Eleanor, her lean build rigid with resolve, stood by the doorway, a silent, living repudiation of the Aegis contract and Vivian's flawless control. The morning sun, usually filtering in to highlight the calculated perfection of the room, only served to illuminate the destruction. Julian, his posture usually reserved and armored, held a new, difficult certainty. He had slept little, driven by the profound and terrifying realization that he had willingly incinerated his old life for a truth he had just discovered. "The terms of the agreement are void," Julian stated, his voice flat, devoid of the weary submission he had carried for years. He detailed the irrevocable escrow transfer securing Clara's life-saving surgery, a final, absolute move that stripped Vivian of her most potent leverage over Eleanor. He spoke of the connection, the transcendence of the contract, and his choice to dismantle the foundation of their decade-long partnership. Vivian Ashworth, sculpted features immobile, listened with an initial, terrifying calm that suggested deep comprehension, not shock. She was wearing a crisp white suit, immaculate against the pale grey furniture, an epitome of cool, calculated elegance that seemed utterly impenetrable. "You have confused genuine emotion with a biological imperative, Julian," Vivian finally responded, her voice dangerously low, a honed edge of intellectual contempt. "She is the biological receptacle for the legacy we painstakingly engineered. Her role, as stipulated in the Aegis contract, was purely functional. This weakness is simply the hormonal byproduct of the protocols we established to ensure uterine receptivity." "It is not weakness," Julian countered, shaking his head slowly. "It is honesty. Something we eradicated from this house long ago. I'm done maintaining the optics, Vivian. Our marriage is a high-stakes corporate transaction, and I am dissolving the agreement entirely. I choose the reality she represents." Vivian turned her intense, icy gaze toward Eleanor. "You believe that because you are carrying the genetic material, you have earned a seat at this table? You, a desperate woman who sold her body and signed a complete non-disclosure agreement with the Solstice Guild. You manipulated him during his weakest moment." Eleanor met Vivian's gaze without flinching, defying the deep-seated fear that still lived in the corners of her stomach. Fueled by years of institutional obedience, she was no longer the self-sacrificing, submissive Eleanor Vance who had signed the Aegis contract out of abject necessity. Julian had secured Clara's future, and in doing so he had freed Eleanor to fight for her own. I have a right to my daughter, Eleanor asserted, her voice ringing with newfound clarity and force. And I refuse to raise her in the toxic isolation of this estate, or as a hidden secret. She deserves a life built on unconditional love and truth, not controlled deception. The word daughter seemed to strike Vivian physically, a sharp, invisible blow. Do you like romance stories? Then leave a comment saying everything has a purpose so I'll know that this story truly spoke to your heart. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. It's free, and you'll receive more stories that touch the soul. 94.8% of the people who watch these videos are still not subscribed to the channel. If you're one of them, don't let this moment pass. Subscribe right now. It is fast, it is free, and it can bring into your life stories that inspire, heal, and reignite hope and love. Her veneer of controlled elegance fractured. For a terrible, revealing second, the raw, wounded woman underneath the immaculate exterior surfaced. Driven by years of emotional repression and the obsessive need for clinical perfection that had ultimately failed her. My legacy, Vivian choked out, her voice rising in a terrible crescendo of pain and fury. My right! I orchestrated this. I managed the protocol. I endured the endless medical testing. I ensured the environment was perfect. You are nothing but a temporary container, Eleanor. You steal everything that I have worked for, that I have controlled, because you dare to exhibit genuine feeling. Vivian's true fear was laid bare, the terrifying realization that love and loyalty, messy, uncontrollable forces, had superseded her decades of careful, calculated planning. Her control, her absolute life-defining mechanism, had failed her entirely. Julian stepped forward, putting his body physically between the two women, a shield for Eleanor. You confused control with connection, Vivian. And the cost was everything. The marriage is over. Vivian screamed, a sound that was less rage and more the profound. Agonizing devastation of loss, not necessarily loss of Julian, but the loss of her structure, her perfect narrative, and the future she had engineered. She hurled a porcelain vase, an antique piece Eleanor knew Julian cherished. Against the pristine glass wall, the sound of the shattering ceramic, a final brutal punctuation mark to their partnership. The legal fallout was immediate and catastrophic, a tempest contained entirely within the highest echelons of corporate and private law. Julian, mobilizing his most formidable legal team, moved with calculated speed to secure Eleanor's position. The central focus was twofold: minimizing the public relations disaster and, more crucially, protecting Eleanor and the developing pregnancy from Vivian's anticipated counterattack. Eleanor was immediately moved from the Blackwood estate, deemed too volatile and too vulnerable to surveillance now that Vivian was fully aware of the breach. Within hours of the confrontation, she was flown via private jet to a remote, highly secure residence near the Pacific coast, a haven of privacy far from the suffocating scrutiny of Manhattan society and the electronic reach of the Blackwood estate. The physical transfer felt like a sudden, dizzying drop from a gilded cage into a vast, terrifying, but ultimately open sky. The change in atmosphere was shocking. In the coastal home, there were no hidden cameras, no prescribed calorie counts, no rigid schedules dictated by Nurse Dana. There was only the sound of the ocean, the salt air, and a pervasive, difficult quiet. Julian, while dealing with the implosion of his public life and the ongoing secretive divorce proceedings, spent every available moment with Eleanor. This period of enforced isolation became the true foundation of their relationship. Away from the pressure of the estate and the clinical detachment required by the Aegis contract. They began to know each other not as employer and asset, but as two people bound by a radical, difficult choice. Julian found himself stripped of the professional armor that had defined him for decades. He confessed to Eleanor the long, slow death of his marriage, the years spent under Vivian's calculated, clinical gaze, their attempts to have a child failing repeatedly, not due to biological reasons, but due to Vivian's paralyzing fear of anything less than absolute, genetic perfection, and her inability to tolerate the vulnerability inherent in natural processes. Their relationship had become a partnership in maintaining the Ashworth image, devoid of shared emotional purpose. "I was hollow," Julian admitted one evening, sitting with Eleanor on the secluded deck, watching the vast Pacific swell. He was wearing casual clothes, his shoulders less rigidly set than they had been in the Blackwood estate. "I believed the infrastructure was the life. That wealth and control were synonymous with success. You showed me the price of that control." Eleanor, her own emotional reserves still fragile, spent her time focusing on the growing life within her, but equally on the secure knowledge that Clara was safe. Clara's surgery was scheduled, the funds irrevocably secured, a weight lifted that allowed Eleanor to breathe. Truly breathe, for the first time since late 2017, when the initial family loss had thrust her into sole guardianship and the desperate scramble for stability. She maintained constant contact with the doctors managing Clara's case, reading and rereading Clara's medical dossier, now not as a weapon held against her, but as the document confirming her sister's imminent safety. But for Julian, the cost was irrelevant. He was gaining a reality, a sense of self, and a connection that transcended corporate titles and market fluctuations. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, the legal battle with Vivian intensified. Vivian, using her considerable financial and legal resources, fought fiercely, attempting to invalidate the Aegis contract's dissolution on the grounds of emotional manipulation and breach of protocol. She tried to assert that Eleanor had no inherent right to be part of the child's life, reverting to the original contractual designation of Eleanor as a gestational service provider. Eleanor's earlier demand, her assertive refusal to be a secret or a mere vessel, became the core of Julian's defense. "She is not a temporary component," Julian testified in a highly protected, private arbitration meeting, his voice unwavering against Vivian's clinical accusations. "She is the emotional and biological reality of this child. We are seeking co-parenting rights, recognizing the natural, inherent bond between mother and child, a right that supersedes the punitive, dehumanizing stipulations of the Aegis contract." The court battle was agonizing, forcing Eleanor to confront the painful details of her past desperation and the invasive stipulations of her entry into the Solstice Guild. But she faced it with fierce conviction, driven by the knowledge that she was fighting for the truth and for her daughter. The ultimate legal settlement was revolutionary for their circles. Vivian retained unprecedented financial wealth, but Julian was granted the divorce and, crucially, a legal agreement that recognized Eleanor Vance as the child's co-parent, a status that shattered every convention of their elite world and infuriated Vivian completely. She was left without the husband, the legacy, or the control she craved. The birth of their daughter, Aurora, was quiet, shielded entirely from the media and the legal machinations. Eleanor held the baby, a small, perfect defiance against the sterile world that had tried to mandate her existence. Looking at Aurora, Eleanor felt a profound, unconditional love that solidified the terrifying choices she had made. This tiny, vulnerable life was the product of desperation, yes, but also of defiance and a refusal to remain silent. The period following the birth was marked by intense scrutiny and the difficult, often exhausting work of building a genuine partnership. Julian had to learn to share authority, trading the command structure of the boardroom for the messy collaboration of parenting. Eleanor had to learn that stability didn't require self-sacrifice. She deserved happiness and partnership. They chose to stay on the Pacific coast, far removed from the suffocating, controlled environment of the Blackwood estate and the demanding presence of Manhattan high society. They purchased a large, sunlit home nestled in the hills overlooking the ocean, a house full of warmth and soft edges, the opposite of the cold marble fortress Julian had inhabited for decades. Clara, now fully recovered from her successful heart surgery, visited frequently. She was a bright, curious girl, thriving under the stability and security Eleanor had risked everything to provide. Clara and Aurora quickly formed a close, unbreakable bond. Two sisters whose lives were intrinsically linked by the unconventional choices of their shared guardian. Eleanor watched them play, and sometimes the memory of the cold despair she felt in summer 2021. When facing Clara's medical dossier and walking into the Solstice Guild, would feel distant, almost unreal. Years passed. The initial scandal faded into complicated history, reduced to a footnote in the glossy biographies of Julian Ashworth, who, despite the initial turmoil, proved that integrity and emotional commitment did not preclude corporate success. His company stabilized, focusing on sustainable, ethical growth, a reflection of the personal change he had undergone. It was a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, years after the confrontation. Eleanor, now 38, stood on the wide porch of their coastal home. Her perpetual weariness had been replaced by a quiet, settled strength. Her lean build was still present, but the tension that used to pull at her shoulders was gone. She watched Julian, who was in his mid-50s, pushing Aurora high on a sturdy, custom-built wooden swing set in the sun-dappled yard. Julian's commanding height and imposing presence were still evident, but his demeanor was softened. He wore well-worn canvas trousers and a faded t-shirt. His hands, once accustomed only to titanium tablets and high-powered steering wheels, now skillfully managed the arc of the swing. Aurora, a bright, curious toddler with a gap-toothed grin, squealed with unrestrained laughter, the sound of a child raised in absolute love and truth, untouched by the surveillance and emotional rigidity of her conception. Julian walked back toward Eleanor, wiping his hands on his trousers, a smudge of dirt near his elbow. The immaculate, tailored appearance was a ghost of the past. He took Eleanor's hand, his powerful grip instantly grounding her. His eyes, once reserved and measured, were now open, full of uncomplicated affection and pride. "She's magnificent," Julian said, his gaze fixed on Aurora. "She is," Eleanor agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "A defiance born from absolute necessity." "And a love forged outside the cage," Julian added, pulling her closer. Their bodies fitting together in a way that spoke of years of navigating shared vulnerability and earned trust. Their love story wasn't easy or conventional. It was defined initially by the cold, sterile terms of the Aegis contract and the high-security surveillance of the Blackwood estate. It had been tested by fire, the implosion of a powerful marriage, social condemnation, and a brutal legal fight. But they had sustained it through the simple, radical act of choosing honesty over control, reality over preservation. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had only sought to save her younger sister Clara, had, in the process, saved Julian Ashworth too, forcing a reckoning that changed everything. They had found their impossible peace in the sunlit chaos of their coastal home, watching the sunlight fall on their daughter Aurora, the culmination of a choice that irrevocably altered the course of their lives. They had achieved a complicated, profoundly real love, defined by the journey from desperation to partnership. If you enjoyed reading about Eleanor and Julian's journey from contract to connection, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. The abrupt departure from the Blackwood estate felt less like an escape and more like an extraction, meticulously executed by Julian's security detail. Eleanor, still vibrating with the residue of confrontation, watched the highly controlled environment recede below the wing of the private jet. The move was essential. Vivian's rage, Julian knew, would manifest not as simple retribution but as strategic, calculated dismantling. The isolated coastal residence, a sprawling, glass-fronted modern structure perched precariously above the churning Pacific, offered a level of security and anonymity that the Manhattan fortress could no longer guarantee. It was a blank slate, but the ink of the Aegis contract and the trauma of the last months still stained the air. For the first few weeks, the silence was overwhelming. In the Blackwood estate, every minute had been accounted for, every meal monitored, every movement scrutinized by the unseen eyes of surveillance systems and the cold professionalism of Nurse Dana. Here, the only sound was the relentless rhythm of the tide, a sound that demanded attention, not compliance. Eleanor found herself navigating the open, sunlit rooms with the residual caution of a caged animal, constantly anticipating a voice, a directive, a clinical instruction that never came. Julian, too, was disoriented. Stripped of the daily ritual of bespoke suits and the relentless pressure of industry leadership, he struggled to define his days. He spent hours on secure video conferences, managing the financial hemorrhage caused by the highly public, yet still secretive, divorce proceedings. But when he was with Eleanor, his focus shifted entirely. He began the painful, necessary work of self-inventory. One evening they sat on the deck, the air cool and thick with sea spray. Eleanor was sipping herbal tea, her gaze lost in the shifting patterns of the water. "You asked me why I stayed so long," Julian said quietly, breaking a long silence. His voice was low, carrying the weight of decades of emotional suppression. "You saw the control, the rigidity, and you correctly identified the hollowness. But what you didn't see was how long I'd convinced myself that was success." Eleanor turned to him, her lean build settled against the cushioned chair, yet still retaining a coiled tension. "You confuse infrastructure with integrity." "Exactly," he conceded, running a hand through his perpetually neat hair, an uncharacteristic gesture of disarray. "Vivian and I built an empire together. The marriage wasn't just a union of two people, it was a merger of philosophies. Control became our currency. I respected her intellect, her unwavering commitment to perfection. When we started trying for a child, she approached it like a strategic acquisition, every variable optimized, every risk mitigated. The failure wasn't physical, Eleanor. The failures were emotional. She couldn't tolerate the uncertainty. She couldn't stand the idea that the child might be flawed in the way humans inherently are. She feared anything that couldn't be managed, controlled, or predicted." He paused, the distant sound of a foghorn emphasizing the isolation. "I realize now that the Aegis contract wasn't just about securing a surrogate. It was about outsourcing the emotional vulnerability entirely. She wanted a perfect outcome without ever having to tolerate the mess of humanity. And I let her. I was exhausted by the performance, but I was terrified of walking away from the structure. I believed that structure was the only thing holding me up." Eleanor understood desperation. It was a language she had spoken fluently since late 2017, when the family loss had destabilized everything, leaving her solely responsible for Clara. Her desperation had led her directly to the Solstice Guild. But Julian's desperation was different. It was the despair of affluence, the isolation born from too much power. "You chose integrity," Eleanor murmured. "That costs you the security you valued most." "I chose reality," Julian corrected, meeting her observant eyes. "You forced me to look at it. You came into the Blackwood estate, a person defined by necessity, yet possessed of an honesty that House hadn't seen in 2 decades. When I looked at you, I saw Clara's medical dossier not just as leverage, but as evidence of a genuine, self-sacrificing love I had never experienced. That bond, that duty, it transcended every contract, every corporate merger, every calculated social move I had ever made. When I chose to secure Clara's future, I didn't just pay off a debt. I paid off my freedom." This period was characterized by long, probing conversations, gradually dismantling the professional barriers that had initially separated them. They navigated the awkwardness of physical intimacy that arose not from contractual obligation, but from growing, genuine affection. Eleanor, still recovering from years of putting her own needs last, had to learn that accepting kindness and partnership was not a luxury, but a right. Julian had to learn to operate without command structure, to treat Eleanor as an equal, a fiercely intelligent woman whose perspective was invaluable, not merely a recipient of his protection. The respite, however, was fleeting. The legal warfare with Vivian raged in the background, consuming Julian's attention whenever he left the coastal sanctuary. Vivian Ashworth, her sculpted features now sharper, more furious in court documents, launched an aggressive campaign to reassert control. She utilized every clause of the Aegis contract and the Solstice Guild's internal agreements, arguing that Julian's decision to dissolve the contract was motivated by undue influence from Eleanor, a desperate woman seeking permanent economic gain. Her legal strategy was brutal. She sought to redesignate Eleanor not just as a gestational service provider, but as a manipulative interloper who had preyed on Julian's emotional vulnerability during a period of stress. The arbitration meetings were held in a secure, anonymous building in downtown Los Angeles, far from the jurisdiction of New York, but still operating under the strict confidentiality clauses necessary to manage the dissolution of a relationship of their financial magnitude. Eleanor was compelled to testify, recounting the harrowing details of her life leading up to her entry into the Solstice Guild. She had to explain the initial family loss, the years spent juggling two minimum wage jobs while maintaining Clara's care, and the moment she received Clara's critical diagnosis, the moment she realized that prohibitively expensive emergency surgery was her only option, leading her to sign the Aegis contract and accept the non-negotiable stipulation regarding her past. Facing Vivian across the mahogany arbitration table was excruciating. Vivian, cool and calculated even amidst her fury, wore a suit the color of glacial ice, her posture rigidly controlled. She listened to Eleanor's testimony with a chilling detachment, as if studying a biological specimen under a microscope. "Miss Vance?" Vivian's lawyer, a razor-sharp corporate litigator named Mr. Sterling, probed. "You entered this agreement solely to acquire the funds necessary for your sister's medical care. Is that correct?" "It is," Eleanor confirmed, her voice steady. "And you were fully aware of the stipulation that, upon the successful delivery of the child, your involvement would cease, and you would receive the substantial final payment to secure Clara's stability, correct?" "I understood the terms of the Aegis contract," Eleanor admitted. "Then, when did this alleged maternal bond, a concept wholly external to the strict contractual nature of this arrangement, begin to manifest? Was it perhaps when Mr. Ashworth started exhibiting signs of disillusionment with his decades-long marriage? Was it when you realized that by leveraging emotional manipulation, you could achieve a financial and social status far beyond your previous capacity?" Sterling pressed, his tone dripping with condescension. Eleanor leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, her fatigue temporarily overridden by a surge of defiant clarity. She was no longer the submissive figure who had accepted the rules of the Blackwood estate. "The bond existed the moment I consented to carry this child," Eleanor asserted. "It existed the moment I agreed to endure the protocols, the isolation, and the scrutiny. I signed the Aegis contract out of absolute necessity, to save Clara. But once that necessity was met, once Julian secured her future, I was free to acknowledge a truth that supersedes any document written by the Solstice Guild. I am the mother of this child." Julian testified next, and his testimony was the pivotal moment. He didn't defend Eleanor's actions. He defended his own profound, terrifying shift in priorities. "My wife Vivian views this child as an asset, a legacy to be engineered and controlled," Julian stated, his voice resonating with commanding authority that had once been reserved for hostile takeovers. "She views Eleanor Vance as a vessel, a temporary disposable resource. I reject that dehumanization entirely. The financial agreements, the contracts, they were necessary to facilitate the medical process. But the emotional reality has transcended them. I am seeking to establish co-parenting rights, recognizing the natural, inherent bond between mother and child, a bond that existed from conception and which, frankly, I choose to protect over any societal preservation or financial outcome." He looked directly at Vivian, a silent acknowledgement of the decades of shared ambition that were now ashes. I have spent 50 years prioritizing control over connection. That ends now. The price of that control was the slow, agonizing death of my own soul. Eleanor represents the opportunity to live authentically, and I will not allow this child to be raised in the toxic, isolating rigidity that defined our marriage at the Blackwood estate. The legal battle dragged on for months, a draining war of attrition that simultaneously solidified the fragile trust between Julian and Eleanor. They fought together, reading through the dense legal documents of the Aegis contract, finding strength in their shared defense against Vivian's relentless pursuit of punitive control. The ultimate settlement, achieved through arduous negotiation, was a public relations nightmare, but a legal victory for Eleanor. Vivian retained an extraordinary financial settlement, the cost Julian paid to buy his freedom and Eleanor's right to partnership. Crucially, the final legal decree recognized Eleanor Vance as a full legal co-parent, a decision that sent ripples through their rarefied social world and irrevocably severed Vivian's narrative of clinical engineered perfection. She lost the future she had obsessively planned, forced to accept that the messy, uncontrollable forces of human connection had won. The final stressful months of pregnancy coincided with the cessation of legal hostilities. With Clara's successful heart surgery completed and her recovery underway under the excellent care provided by the secured funds, Eleanor finally allowed herself a period of rest and anticipation. The birth of their daughter, Clara, was quiet, contained entirely within a private wing of a discreet hospital near the coast. There were no flashing lights, no media speculation, only Julian's powerful hand holding Eleanor's, grounding her through the intensity, holding Clara for the first time small, perfect. A tangible rejection of the sterile protocols that had mandated her existence, Eleanor felt a depth of love that was utterly purifying. She looked up at Julian, his face streaked with an emotion she had never seen on him before, a mixture of profound awe and fear. "She's real," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "Completely," Julian agreed, leaning down to press a kiss to Eleanor's forehead. "And entirely ours." The first year of parenthood was a sharp, unrelenting course correction for Julian. He was used to issuing commands and expecting immediate, flawless execution. Clara, however, operated on instinct, hunger, and whim. Julian, the titan of industry, found himself humbled by late-night feedings, diaper changes, and the absolute vulnerability of this new, shared life. He learned patience. He learned collaboration. He learned that sharing authority meant trusting Eleanor's intuition, which had been sharpened by years of caring for Clara under duress. Eleanor, meanwhile, had to dismantle her deeply ingrained habit of self-sacrifice. She struggled with the concept of accepting comfort and ease. Julian had to constantly remind her that her partnership was valued, not just her capacity for endurance. "You don't have to prove your worth through suffering anymore." "Eleanor," he told her one evening, finding her still working late on documents related to Clara's long-term educational trust. "It's hard to stop," she confessed, rubbing her tired eyes. "Survival mode is a comfortable uniform. It fits." "Take it off," Julian insisted, pulling her gently into his arms. "We are building something new here, something warm. Doesn't need walls or contracts. It just needs us, being honest." They consciously chose to root their family on the Pacific coast, away from the toxic scrutiny of Manhattan and the perpetual presence of the ghost of the Blackwood estate. They bought a larger home, one with mismatched, comfortable furniture, shelves stacked with books, and open spaces where the sun flooded in. It was a home designed for living, not for presentation. Clara, thriving after her successful surgery, became a constant, happy presence. She was now a bright, curious young teenager, fascinated by her baby sister. Clara understood, perhaps better than anyone, the immense sacrifice Eleanor had made. She often watched Eleanor and Julian together, recognizing the hard-won peace they had achieved. Their bond was fiercely protective, founded on shared trauma and the realization that their family structure, though unconventional, was built on genuine, unconditional love. Years passed, softening the hard edges of the past. The initial scandal faded into the annals of complicated, sensationalized history, a peculiar footnote in the story of Julian Ashworths. Transformation from corporate ice king to ethically focused entrepreneur. His company, having weathered the initial turmoil, stabilized and grew, built on a new philosophy that valued sustainability and transparency, a reflection of the personal integrity he had finally embraced. It was an autumn afternoon, 8 years after Eleanor had first walked into the Solstice Guild. A desperate woman carrying Clara's medical dossier like a shield. Eleanor, now 38, stood on the wide cedar porch overlooking the ocean. The years had replaced her perpetual fatigue with a quiet, settled strength. Her lean build still held grace, but the constant, tight anxiety was gone, replaced by the resilience of someone who had fought for and won her own definition of happiness. She watched Julian, who was in his mid-50s, laughing as he pushed Clio on the sturdy, custom-built swing set. Julian's commanding presence was still evident, but his demeanor was permanently softened. He wore worn canvas trousers and a faded navy t-shirt, his movements relaxed, unhurried. His hands, which had once signed billion-dollar deals, were now adept at managing the arc of the swing. Clio, a bright 7-year-old with her mother's intensely observant eyes and her father's inherent gravitas, shrieked with pure, unrestrained joy. Her laughter was the sound of a child raised in absolute security and truth, untainted by the surveillance and emotional rigidity that had defined the circumstances of her conception. Julian walked toward Eleanor, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn. He wiped a smudge of dirt from his forearm, a domestic detail that would have been unimaginable to the Julian Ashworth of the Blackwood estate. He took Eleanor's hand, his powerful grip instantly grounding her, a silent acknowledgement of their shared foundation. "She hit the sky that time," Julian said, his eyes fixed on Clio, who was running to investigate a fallen pinnacle. "She inherited your defiance," Eleanor responded, leaning her head against his shoulder. The fit was perfect, the product of years of navigating shared vulnerability and earned trust. A defiance born from absolute necessity 8 years ago. "And a love forged outside the cage," Julian added, pulling her closer, his gaze turning inward, reflecting on the arduous journey. "I remember thinking, when you first signed the Aegis contract, that this was just a functional arrangement, clinical. I had no idea that contract was actually a suicide note for my old life." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that erased the memory of the pinched anxiety she had worn for years. "I only wanted to save Clara. I had no idea that the price of that contract would be everything I ever truly wanted. Partnership. A life where I didn't have to disappear." Their love story remained complicated, a unique trajectory defined initially by the cold, sterile terms of the Aegis contract and the high-security surveillance of the Blackwood estate. It had been tested by the fire of corporate collapse, social condemnation, and a brutal legal fight against Vivian, who still, years later, remained a cold, distant entity defined by her loss of control. But they had sustained their relationship through the simple, radical choice to prioritize honesty over optics, reality over preservation. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had sought only to secure her sister's life, had, in the process, irrevocably saved Julian Ashworth too. She had forced a reckoning that shattered the foundations of his controlled existence, leading them down a difficult but profoundly honest path. Do you like romance stories? Then leave a comment saying everything has a purpose, so I'll know that this story truly spoke to your heart. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. It's free, and you'll receive more stories that touch the soul. 94.8% of the people who watch these videos are still not subscribed to the channel. If you're one of them, don't let this moment pass. Subscribe right now. It's fast, it's free, and it can bring into your life stories that inspire, heal, and reignite hope and love. They had achieved their impossible peace in the sunlit chaos of their coastal home. Watching the last light of the day fall on their daughter Clio, the living, breathing culmination of a choice that changed everything. Their journey from desperation to partnership, from a signed document to a shared loving life, was proof that the most real connections are often found in the places we are most terrified to look. If this story of complicated love and defiant partnership resonates with you, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button to follow more journeys of courage and unexpected connection.